Okay, why don't we get started? Good evening. Good evening. All right, good. I want to check everybody's still there. My name is Vincent Sutherland. I am the executive director of the Center on Race and Equality in the Law here at NYU School of Law. And I, first of all, want to welcome all of you for our third panel of this colloquium on reparations, focused on future possibilities, paving the path forward. We have a phenomenal group of panelists with us here this evening. And one of the things I want to do, though, is make this very much a conversational piece of this colloquium. And so I'm hoping to open it up to the audience for questions about half or two-thirds of the way through. And questions means questions, okay? You all know what I'm talking about. Questions, okay? But let me first introduce our panelists. Sitting right to my, immediately to my left is Jennifer Bellamy, who serves as Senior Legislative Counsel in the ACLU's National Political Advocacy Department, where she advocates on a range of racial justice issues. Jennifer played a leadership role in the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which reduced discriminatory sentencing and address some of the racial disparities plaguing the criminal justice system at the federal level. Seated next to her is Professor Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, who is a professor of community justice and social economic development and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College. She's a political economist specializing in solidarity economics, cooperative economics, worker ownership, and black political economy. And seated next to her is Casey Foster, who is the co-director of the Youth Power Project at Make the Road New York. The Youth Power Project brings together young people across New York City and Long Island to organize and build power to confront, challenge, and dismantle systems of oppression and build thriving communities. Casey was also instrumental in the Movement for Black Lives reparations platform. And so please welcome all our panelists. So we've heard a great deal tonight and this afternoon, first about to whom reparations are owed and why, what current forms of reparations look like both here on the ground in communities in the United States and internationally, and where those efforts are underway. And of course, our panel is really focused on the future of reparations and what that looks like. And given that this is a kind of future and forward-looking panel on reparations, I'm wondering if each of you can take a few moments to just tell us first, how do you define reparations? I think that's an important thing for us to start with, and to whom they're owed, and what kind of innovative approaches to reparations, policies or practices are you currently thinking about or working on in your own work? And Jennifer, why don't we start with you?
Thanks so much for inviting me and the ACLU and for convening this illustrious group. It's always exciting to see law students who are looking to make an impact in the world, and that's one of the things that we try to do at the ACLU. We support H.R. 40 and S. 1083. Those are two pieces of federal legislation that would establish a commission that would examine the institution of enslavement and its lasting impact. And in addition to examining that institution, it would make recommendations to Congress for remedies to address the institution as well as its impact. We think that both of those pieces are important. So it's, in our view, for a commission of experts to take a look at the institution of slavery in a way that has not been holistically examined before. So that we can then make a determination of what should reparations be. I think it requires a thorough study and examination in order to answer that holistically, and also in determining where is it appropriate for that redress to go. That is another place that the commission could be very much invaluable. So that's why we support those two federal vehicles.
Great, cool. Great, thank you. And Professor Gordon-Nembhard, what about you?
Good evening, everybody. Thanks also, I agree, thanks to the organizers. Thanks to all of you for staying. I know it's been a long day already. I also, like some of the other panelists from previous panels, want to acknowledge our ancestors and also the original stewards of the land, and talk about how important it is, the right to control land, labor, livelihood. I think that's the basis for when I think about reparations, right? The fact that we, people of African descent, have been denied the ability to control life, land, livelihood, labor. And so for me, reparations are that restitution, both financial and spiritual restitution. I really agreed with everything I heard already. I didn't hear the very first panel, but everything in the second panel, so I don't want to go over all that, but I do want to add something. I think we don't talk enough about the asset stripping and the lack of control, not just of our bodies having been property, but also our labor, right? Enslavement was all about work, right? Men's work, women's work, and children's work, right? And about the fact that people of African descent were just considered for their work without them having any control over that work. And so for me, also, reparations is about the restitution to control over work, right? To give us back, democratize work, control over labor, democratizing capital, that kind of thing. So I think I'm going to get another time to talk about more concrete things, right? Or is it now the time? Sure. I'm trying to figure out when I should say which things. But anyway, so I'm very much concerned that we make sure to recognize how important control over all means of production. As much as I'm interested in the spiritual reparations, I really want us to focus on economic and financial reparations to create economic democracy and economic justice. And so a lot of the focus I have is to look at how can we create systems now, right? Recreate, what's his name last time talked about how we not repeat is to change the systems, right? And not be complicit in the systems. I'm worried that if we just ask for our check, right? We live in a racialized capitalist society, so our check just lets us put money right back into that racialized capitalist society. And we haven't really changed anything, and yet we might feel restored a little bit or feel a little bit better because the society has so made us so, worried just about getting that money. I want us to think about ways that we can actually change the system, stop racialized capitalism, because one of the effects of enslavement, colonialism, et cetera, was that it created racialized capitalism and allowed it to flourish. And so we have to dismantle that. And so some of the easy ways to dismantle that are to look at solidarity economy and cooperative economics movements. And so I've written about this before, but my argument is that we should actually take a lot of that money, not all of it, because we owed money for a bunch of things, but some of the money should go into pots of money for communities to restore ourselves by creating worker cooperatives. And we need to do education, so we need money to do co-op business education, we need money for startups, we need money to help young people start their own co-ops so they can start in a system that doesn't swallow them up and take control over them. I can talk about all the different benefits of cooperatives in terms of, again, giving people control over their work and their labor, their wealth, right? They give back to community, they solve community problems, they give community control over solving community problems through an economic means, and I can go on and on about that if we have time. You can ask me more about that. But I wanted to make sure we put on the table those concrete options for how we actually change the system and to use the reparations money for that.
Thank you. And Casey.
Thank you. I also want to thank the organizers and everyone for coming out tonight and not rushing home to see this debate tonight, staying with us. So I also want to just appreciate those that came before us in the struggle, especially in the conversation about reparations, Queen Mother Moore, and the other elders that have been really, leading the struggle for generations before us. I also heard the earlier panel, and I think for me, an understanding of reparations isn't a similar framework that has been laid out by other panelists tonight, right? Like we have to stop the ongoing harms, and there has to be some guarantee that those harms will not continue. There has to be some sort of restitution, repair, acknowledgement, and compensation. I think in terms of the organizing work, moving for Black Lives, I would say in terms of thinking about reparations for the systemic denial of access to public education for Black people, that it's still very much in an exploration stage. A lot of our organizing now around education is harm reduction. A lot of the organizing now around education is to take back some community control for our communities of one of the last public goods that we actually have. And so I think what's important around any efforts for reparations around educational reparations is that effort has to be grounded in some sovereignty and community control for Black communities, leading the effort in terms of whatever solutions that folks are trying to develop long-term for reparations. I think, in terms of the organizing, I mentioned harm reduction. I think just in a historical context, right, like from the beginning of a colonial settler land, right, like enslaved Africans that were brought here were denied access to education through both state and state-backed violence and terror, right? Moving forward, we look at, Reconstruction, any sort of effort for Black people to set up educational spaces in their communities were often targeted by white violence and white terror, leading all the way up into the fights to integrate schools in the North and Midwest and California, and then the systemic underinvestment in Black educational spaces throughout this country. There's been a destabilizing of access to education for Black people in this country, not just those that are seeking education, also those that are providing education, right? And so, for example, in New Orleans, post-Katrina, right, they passed an ordinance, they fired everyone who was an educator or anyone else who was employed by the New Orleans education system, which was a system that was almost 70, 80% Black staff, and educators and bus drivers and cafeteria workers. When they privatized New Orleans, one of the first things they did was break the union and fired all the teachers who had been scattered, surviving for their life. And so I think when we think about educational reparations, it's both thinking about how we are setting up reparations on a communal level for those that have been denied access to education, but it's also repairing the harm for the educators and the other folks in the community that have created and set up educational spaces in our community that have either been destabilized through disinvestments or they've actually had their livelihoods taken from them from the privatization and other kind of neoliberal policies that have been set forth by pretty much every administration we've had going back from the 80s to now. And so really, I think for educational reparations, we are at a point still where we need to do a full accounting of the damage that's been done, and we need to document that throughout history up until now, and I can get into some of the ways in which Black people are still systematically being denied access to public education.
Thank you. So I guess I'm curious, kind of hearing each of you talk about kind of different ways in which this worldview around reparations manifests itself in your own work and what you're looking to kind of going forward. What do you see as kind of the most significant challenge to the efforts that you are trying to advance? I think there is, in reading kind of the 1619 Project, I think there is, part of that project talks about out of slavery and the anti-Black racism that it required grew nearly everything that's truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet and popular music, the inequities in the public health and education system, its astonishing penchant for violence, income inequality, It's slang, legal system, racial fears and hatreds that continue to drive policy today. That's kind of a ground truth, I think, for a lot of folks in this room. But I'm wondering kind of in the space in terms of trying to advance the ball, how do you move people who don't see that as a ground truth, they don't even acknowledge that as a truth? And then I guess, on top of that, what do you see as other challenges in terms of your own work? Casey, you're not in your head, so I'll hold you first.
That's a great question. I think in terms of education, our public education system, one of the greatest challenges is that there are so many other systems embedded and integrated into our public education system now that the ways that which black children are disappeared into these other systems it's hard to challenge because you're not just challenging the public education system. So, example, I don't know if people saw, but there was a video about a young black girl in Florida about 6 years old that's kind of circulating on the internet now. The social worker or guidance counselor or someone else in her school called the police because she was being a 6-year-old and she's black. So they called the police on her. The police showed up, took her in a police car to a mental health hospital and basically disappeared her there for 2 days in objection of her mother, right? And so you have the kind of social services embedded in schools that are not there to protect and support black children. They're really there to look for ways to disappear them and dispossess them of their education. And then I think most prominently in most of our schools, which you have the criminal legal system embedded and integrated into our schools, right? And so when you look at New York City has only 2,800 guidance counselors for 1 million students, and it has 5,500 school police officers in schools, right? And so the education system has really become a place where other systems have kind of integrated their way in there in a way to dispossess black children from access to education. And so, within schools, you're looking at students being suspended, you're looking at students being arrested, you're looking at getting criminal summons. In some school districts around the country, students get monetary fines for being late to school and truant. And so the public education system has been, other harmful systems have been so wrapped into the public education system. You're not just fighting the public education system when you're organizing, you're fighting all these other systems that have been brought in really perverse ways. And so for folks that are doing education organizing, a lot of what it feels like we're doing is harm reduction. And the other, I think, challenge is, you look at New York City, there's no public control over New York City's education system because it's mayoral control, right? Which is like a false version of any code of community control. The mayor will say, you elect me, and by you electing me, that is the city saying that I am the sole person to be responsible for schools. Well, in the places where they have mayoral control or emergency managers over schools are also the cities in which the majority of students going to school are black and brown, right? And so the same way that you have an emergency manager over the Detroit schools, that was the same emergency manager in Flint that poisoned children, right? The same way in Philadelphia that you have emergency managers. It's only in public school districts where our children are the majority that the right for parents and community members to have some control over those schools is systematically stripped away. And so that, I think, is a big challenge in the organizing that we're doing, is that we don't have much say or public control over our schools. And there are so many other systems that are already integrated that are dispossessing children of access to an education that you're fighting on a lot of different multiple fronts. I would say some of the advantages, opportunities we have are black people for a long time has seen the fight for public education as one of the forefronts, right, of our fight for civil rights and human rights in this country. And so there's a long history of different tactics that have been used all over the country. In New York City, we had the largest walkout ever, right? The largest public walkout for public education, which was organized a lot by black mothers and folks from clergy, And in other places around the country, I think we've seen that you can rally people around education because it's still one of the few public goods where a lot of we rely on it and is yet to be fully privatized. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring people together around organizing for educational reparations. And there's also a lot of challenges that are still remain.
I would just like to weigh in and say change takes time, but if we're committed to it, we see change. And, you know, one of the things that I'm hopeful about is that you all are here because you're interested in learning about the topic. And hopefully our time together will activate people in a way that others will also be interested in seeing change in this area. When we first, you know, when this idea was first, you know, conceived legislatively by Congressman Conyers, he did not have a lot of support. He introduced this bill faithfully year after year, and the support built over time. You know, groups rallied around it. You know, people spent a lot of time and resources into educating the country about why we need a federal approach to reparations, because slavery was a federal crime. So we have to have, in addition to the things that are happening at the state level, we have to have a federal solution as well. And so it didn't start off with a lot of support, and it took a lot of effort and building over time. But now we have more support in the House of Representatives than we've ever had before. We have 122 co-sponsors. That's significant. We have support in the Senate at a level that we haven't had previously. We didn't previously have a Senate companion bill. So change takes time, and it takes commitment, and so we can't expect to see it overnight, but if it's something that we believe in, it's definitely something that we can achieve. And I'll just say, finally, the majority of the Democratic hopefuls, you know, so far have expressed a commitment to seeing one of the bills get passed. And so that is a huge sea change from the fact that this was not on the radar, this was not a topic of national conversation before, but now it has a national platform. So I just want to say that to urge us to continue to push for this because we can see this through to the finish line.
Right, yeah. And Jessica, yeah.
Yeah, so let me add a few more challenges onto here. I think we sort of mentioned it, but I'll talk more about it. The lack of understanding our history, and I mean that both for African American people of African descent and also people of European descent in this country. Actually, let me go back to one of my pet peeves about history, which is the 1619 stuff. 1619 is really important, and I love the work that's come out about it, but I really have a problem because 1619 feeds into our Eurocentric notion of, and actually our British notion, because actually the Spanish were the first people who brought people of African descent in chains here to US soil. But we forget about Florida, New Mexico, South Carolina even had Spanish bring in African people. And so actually African people were first forcibly brought to the United States territory in the early 1500s. So it's almost an extra 100 years that we should be talking about. And the fact that we're not talking about it allows us to also see ourselves as only British when we're not. It allows us to keep a divide between black and brown people because the brown people are the Spanish and we're the British. And so we need to also get away from that and see this as everybody's issue, and African people having been here much sooner that's not than the British. We're not British-centric, or we shouldn't be. And most of the African historians actually believe Africans brought themselves, right, to the Americas way before that in canoes and stuff, but luckily at least they brought themselves, and that wasn't forced labor. If we want to talk about forced migration, we can talk about at least starting in the 1500s. But that's the kind of lack of history that I think we're up against. We all live in these mythologies. we don't know enough about all the atrocities and all the, right? And we focus on minute things and simple things. And so then because of those mythologies, we also dismiss things like the call for reparations and that kind of thing. So I think the first issue is education, not just the kind that my colleague here is talking about, but just the basic education of what these real systems are, et cetera. Also, I'm not one of those who thinks that reparations is just for enslavement. I think it's for racial economic oppression throughout the, whatever I said now, 500 years of history. And so for people who keep saying, oh, well, it's over, right? We abolished it, it's over, we did whatever. Well, first of all, enslavement is not over. There's lots of forms of it that still exist, whether it's people in prison who constitutionally are still enslaved, they didn't get freed from the Constitution, whether it's enslavement of unjust labor relations and people taking our labor power and our labor and not compensating us properly, right? So slavery still exists, but so we either have to talk about it that way or we have to talk about economic injustice and economic oppression. And so I think, again, we need to make sure we're all educated. I think that also helps with white privilege, because white privilege, they keep trying to say, well, only this and only these people, only whatever, and don't want to see their own complicity. They don't want to see that they inherited, right? The wealth that they inherited was on the backs of the asset stripping that happened to black and brown people, et cetera. So I think those issues are get in the way for all of us, and especially for me to talk about economic reparations. I also, if I could read my own handwriting, I think we also don't understand the alternatives. So people, you know, I actually sometimes have my students debate in class whether we should have financial reparations or not, because they're okay with apologies and monuments and that kind of stuff. A lot of people are more comfortable with that, even sending people to college, you know, getting college money for college, people are okay with that. But when you really talk about financial reparations, they don't want people to get a check. Even my black and brown students, they think that's like the most stupid, horrible thing to do. And they can't figure out where the money would come from or how it would do it. In my field with solidarity economics and cooperatives, one of the things we don't understand is how those are viable, right? Why would we put hard-earned money into doing education and startups to do worker co-ops and stuff? And so we don't know that history either. I wrote a book called Collective Courage, which actually tried to trace the history of African American the cooperative economics movement and economic cooperation among African Americans from at least the 1700s, to show that we have a legacy. We know how to do this. We know how to work together non-exploitatively, how to share wealth, how to create wealth together, how to use it for important things to create our communities. We know how to do it. We got thwarted. In fact, that's one of the articles I wrote for reparations, is we also need reparations because co-op efforts got sabotaged. Some people got lynched, the co-ops got burned down, banks wouldn't lend, insurance companies upped the insurance, you know, just to stop, railroads wouldn't transport the goods, just to stop us from doing economic democracy. So, you know, there's more reasons once you get the right history and once you see what we're doing. But once you can see the alternatives, then it's not so far-fetched to say, let's put all this money into making sure these alternatives, that we can do them now and that we can teach our children how to do them so they don't have to buy into a system that's broken and killing us and killing the planet and that kind of thing.
Great. So I'm going to ask just one more question before I kind of open it up to the audience. So one thing that kind of, because we are thinking about this in like futuristic, or our panel is focused on kind of the future, I'm wondering how many folks are familiar with the show The Watchmen? Okay, so some folks. All right, so I'll explain like very briefly the premise. It's a show on HBO, it's a comic book, but the bottom line is in the show, it's kind of an alternate universe to our current times. And one of the things that's happened in this kind of alternate universe to our current times is that reparations have been paid in some form. And it's I think in the course of the show, those who have received reparations are, that notion is used as kind of a slur against those folks. And there's a whole movement that rises up against that effort. So my question is kind of related to something that was said on an earlier panel about how racism is kind of a shapeshifter. And you can expect that if you were able to achieve reparations, that there will be some type of response to that. I'm wondering what you think the response might be and what we can do to steel ourselves against that response now to avoid dealing with it down the road, or if we can do anything to deal with it down the road.
I guess I would say I don't know that it can get much worse. So I'll take whatever the post-reparations world looks like, right? Racism without reparations, racism plus reparations, it's just racism. So racism after a remedy is okay, if the alternative is just racism, without a remedy. And I guess I'll say, in addition to that, we have a history of this already. We provided reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned after World War II, and this exact same question came up. How are people going to react? Will there be a backlash against Japanese Americans for receiving reparations? And over $1 billion in reparations in other forms beyond financial reparations were paid to the Japanese community for the crime that was committed against that community. And so the idea that racism gets worse after a remedy, I guess I don't have a lot of faith in that theory.
So, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, I don't know that racism can get any worse. It's already pretty bad. My utopia, sort of, is, again, if we have this economic democracy, right? If we have enough people who understand how to do it, who are practicing it, in some ways, who the hell cares about racism? Because one of the biggest problems about racism is that it destroys our ability to feed ourselves, to live in decent housing, to work with dignity, right, et cetera. So a lot of the economic things that racism does, if we can circumvent that, right, if we can create our own system that eliminates that kind of economic exploitation so that we're feeding ourselves, we have dignified work, we're living in good housing, our children can grow up with some opportunities and some control over the world, we own our land collectively, we own our companies collectively, et cetera, then if people want to be racist against us, that's the least of our problems at that point. I don't mean to minimize it, but I can live with that if racism isn't stopping me from feeding my children and staying well and that kind of thing. So if we can think about the things that we do, the remedies that we have, that can take that power away, the power to keep us poor and sickly, right, then I'm okay with it, if people want to try to impose other kinds of racism or keep other kinds of racism going. Again, I know it sounds a little naive, but I just think if we need to kind of separate some of the impacts, right, because I'm not sure we're ever going to stop people from trying to use their power against people that they think are different. And I don't think we're ever going to stop some people from thinking they're superior and that means they can control their people's lives and do whatever. I'm not sure we can do that, but if we can control our part, right? If we can stop the asset stripping, stop the economic exploitation, if we can at least control our piece, I think that's something.
I don't have anything to add.
All right, cool. All right, so why don't we open it up to the audience? I know we have folks with mics. I saw this hand go up first, right here in the front. And so if you could just keep your question to an actual question, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Lee Levin. I am working with Professor Sonia Jarvis at Baruch College. We are doing a project on reparations in terms of educational equity. So I wanted to ask Casey, what do you see as the reparations that would be appropriate
That's a
in 25 words or less?
big question for one person. I think it's too much for me to say what I see as the appropriate reparations for historical harms, specifically around the public education system. I think there are ways in which, in a lot of the organizing that we're doing around reparations, that education should be a key component. And so one of the recent organizing victories around reparations, and I don't want to be inaccurate because I wasn't a part of this effort, but the folks in Chicago that were organizing around, there was an officer, John Burge, and other Chicago officers that were torturing Black Chicagoans en masse. And so the families and the people that have been tortured by the officer, they started organizing for reparations from the city of Chicago, right? There's a youth group that was involved called We Charge Genocide. They got an apology on the record from the city of Chicago. The families of the people who have been tortured were compensated. The educational components that I think are important is in 4th and 8th grade social study classes, the city of Chicago public schools now have to teach about that torture. On the south side of Chicago, they're supposed to open up and create monuments that mark and are a kind of physical living monument to the survivors, but also to acknowledge that the city of Chicago and its police department were torturing Black people en masse across the south side of Chicago. And so I think that was a huge victory. I mean, they went to Geneva and the UN and testified, and there was amazing organizing around that. And so I think a lot of the work that people are doing around organizing, there are communal educational things that we can win in those projects. I think about New York City, you talk about people's history, right? Like, how many people in New York City know that there was a thriving Black community in Central Park that was bulldozed? How many people know that on the north side of Staten Island, there was a thriving Black community that was bulldozed, right? And so I think when we think of educational reparations, I think we have to think about how we create and build answers and build things that are going to teach the whole community, and that will be here for generations of people to learn the history. And so I think that's something that we need to do a lot of thinking about, do a lot of documenting about, do a lot of accounting for. And it's a process that I, as one single, like there should be a communal process that's coming up with more systemic solutions for educational reparations.
Gentleman in the green, and then
Peace. All right. I just wanted to correct something first before I start, right? It is not going to be a gradual process, or it should not be a gradual process. You all need to understand that when George Washington and the founding father slave master bastards were upset with England, it did not take 100 years. They did not have to go through all these trials and legislation. The people had to have the will to make the move. And when George Washington and his cronies got ready, they made the move, and there was an American Revolution. There was a move in France for a revolution for the people against Marie and her give the people cake. You have to stop being complacent. These are our ancestors. Many of you have not been to the continent, but for you law students, you should understand that our ancestors never stopped fighting for their freedom from the time they were first corralled to the shores. There's a place in Ghana called Asin Manso and Asin Praso where they were not just put in a housing or jail, they were put down 20, 30 feet in the ground. And if it rained and it got flooded, there was no cover, so they drowned there. When they took them to the shores in places like Elmina, they didn't just have a place for men and a dungeon for women and a dungeon for men. They had a separate, smaller dungeon for those who they saw were the leaders, and they separated them. And the doors to those places have a space about this big for air and light to come in. This is what your ancestors have been through. You cannot be complacent about this issue. Reparations is not just for enslavement. Reparations is for those people Like in South Carolina, where I and my Moscata's from, South Carolina is called the rice state. The people that were brought to South Carolina had skills. They were not just brutes, right? They went to particular parts of Ghana, not Ghana, to Africa, that people knew how to plant the rice crop, and they went specifically for those people. They went specifically for people who knew how to smelt iron. They went specifically for people who knew animal husbandry and could take care of the animals. They went specifically for people that knew other skills. So it's not just the theft of the labor, it's not just the theft of the personhood, it's the theft of the particular skills. And then after slavery, when the people had nothing, but they still went out and looked for their families, and they built communities. The communities were doing better than most white communities. They destroyed those communities. Y'all need to understand that as you go about your legal practice. I hope some of you deal with this issue. They destroyed the things that people built up from nothing, they destroyed. And you need to understand that when you fight for this. So you cannot be complacent. Even today, we have the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone and all these empowerment zones and this new thing that Trump put in effect. Right? That's supposed to empower the people. The corporations are going to steal that money. They are not going to make that money accessible to your people. And worse, when you still try to build something like my friend Moshood and many others did, they send in inspectors to constantly harass you and tax you. They do not want us to have anything. The only way that we are going to get something is by demanding it. And for those of you, I know there are good white people in here, but there were good white people in Nazi Germany. There were good white people during the period of enslavement, right? Some stood up for us. It's for you white people, for you Asian people, you other people that come here and don't understand why the African American is in the condition they're in. It's up to you to look at that history and understand that history. We don't need a damn bill. Just recently, the homosexual or the LGBTQ community in Europe got reparations. They did not have to have an HR 40. They did not have to have a study about the effects of slavery and the history of their oppression as LGBTQ people.
Sir, I have to just.
That's what I want to say. We taking this too complacently. The only way that we're going to get something is by demanding it, like our brother Roger Wareham here and other people.
Speaking of demands, please, question.
All right.
Do you have a question?
So my question is to you is how are you going to change your attitude and your ferocity towards this subject, because we can't wait for another 100 years.
Okay. So does anyone want to speak to kind of this notion of progress and time?
That's a hard act to follow. I'll just say that I do believe we need to make the road as we do it, so we need to start practicing these things. So that's sort of my mantra in all this. That's why I want to get young people to start their own co-ops and stuff. We need to just start doing this stuff. And then, and as we do it, right, we can keep demanding more and more, but we just need to do it. We don't need to wait. We don't need to see if it's okay or even wait until we have enough money or whatever. We just need to start practicing the ways that we know we should be relating to each other and the ways that we know we should be doing economic development in the best ways that we can, and just keep doing it.
Yeah, I would also say I think there are people that are doing. I mean, someone mentioned Soul Fire Farm earlier, right? There are projects in New York and in a lot of places where people are doing it, and I think that's what it takes, right, to start a bigger movement, is that there are folks doing it now. We should learn about those folks that are doing it now. You can link up with those folks that are doing it now. There's a lot of organizing that's happening in different places too that are bringing that ferocity to their organizing and are freeing people from cages, and in a lot of different ways that are confronting and challenging the system and doing it now.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate your comments too. Yep.
Thank you for the wake-up call. I wanted to sort of give homage to some students at Georgetown University we all know who recently did stand up and ask the question of their institution how to address slavery, the complicity of their institution with slavery and the legacy of slavery. So we do know young people are aware of these issues. Part of the challenge for us, I think, as legal minds and as older people who've been aware of the issues for longer, is that we see the resistance. We know that legally there's a lot of challenges. It's very difficult. The human rights framework doesn't exist in this country to fight reparations in the courts the way we need to. So what I wanted to ask you all is, specifically because we're in an educational institution today, if you could talk about your concept of reparative justice in institutions, maybe educational institutions, but maybe in the ACLU itself. How can we start? A lot of people are asking, how do we start? We have institutions that have been complicit in all of this history, and we're stakeholders in the solution. So just wanted to ask that.
So I can just say the ACLU supports HR 40 and S 1083. We supported a similar federal bill to provide reparations for Japanese Americans, and that was passed, and people were able to receive reparatory justice in that instance. And so that is what the ACLU supports, and that's what we are pushing.
I think it's an interesting question. A lot of the work that we do are with people high school age in public education institutions. I think what we've learned is we can put a lot of energy in trying to change the institutions by working with those institutions and working to change them from within. I think we learn more when we try to create spaces in our community outside of those institutions. So for example, a lot of work that a lot of organizations are doing now, which I heard mentioned earlier, is around restorative and transformative justice. We've tried to create spaces within public schools where we're creating more restorative culture within the public school. And when you don't control the institution or system, it's really limited in the type of liberatory work that you're able to do within it. And so for us, we're thinking much more about how we can utilize resources instead of just kind of building a restorative space within a local school, right, to build a restorative place throughout the community, whether that's through restorative justice institutes, whether that's through training our folks in restorative practices and restorative justice. I think we will learn more by first doing in the community and figuring out how we're less shackled, right, trying to do it within our own community than we are within a lot of institutions. That's not to say there isn't work to be done in institutions. I can't speak as much about higher ed. I think in public education, a lot of that work is harm reduction. And if our folks are there, I think it's worth people putting energy towards harm reduction in the institutions where folks are.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add much because I think I agree with you that a lot of it is what we do in our communities. I do think that there's certainly a role, especially like the students at Georgetown and other places, to force your institution to reckon with its history and to do something about it, if only free tuition for certain people, right? But those kinds of gestures, I guess, are so superficial in some way that there's got to be more. So I think it is more about, right, we need ways to think about enhancing group rights, and right, the solutions really have to be about the community and about community control and group rights. And so whatever we can do to keep pushing at that level, and then from the bottom up, get demands happening from the bottom up, I think is going to be the thing that will be most, I don't know, meaningful seems like such a horrible word. But anyway, most transformative, how about that? If we go back to, I was using that language from the guy at FOR about, how do we not repeat, right? How do we not be complicit? We really have to change systems. And so we have to commit ourselves to changing systems regardless of where they are. FOR I thought was also interesting because they were looking at how they were complicit and stuff, and they changed it by creating new fellowships and new focuses and things like that. So certainly all that can happen, but it's not enough. We really have to figure out how to do that really deep paradigm shift, system change work.
Question in the back?
Where does this campaign fit within current competing models of socialism versus capitalism?
Well, the coward's answer to that is that I try to stay away from those two I try not to be bifurcated like that. That's why I focus on solidarity economics and economic cooperation. I don't want to get into a huge critique, but I have critique of socialism as well as critique of capitalism. And socialism is kind of a reformist thing. It's probably better than not, than still having racialized capitalism, but I think we need to, again, go much deeper. So I'd rather look at what the principles of how we want to operate are and not worry about the titles, the names, the camps, or the denominations, right? But let's think about the principles. And to me, the principles are what? Non-exploitation, non-hierarchy, right? Community well-being, well-being for everybody, empowerment, decent work and control over assets, those kinds of things. So let's think about, I prefer to think about it that way.
We have a question. Oh, right here.
All right, thank you.
Yep, sure.
I'm with an organization called the December 12th Movement, and I'm also an attorney. I was one of the attorneys on the suit, the Afro-American descendants litigation on slavery that Professor Wesley talked about. And I think it's important in terms of, this question is not so much directed to the panel, because the panel has spoken to a lot of it, but to the audience itself. The litigation, when we went into the litigation, we understood the limitations of the legal system in this country. But what the litigation did was it stimulated a discussion all around the country in terms of what should reparations be, and that's what I think the purpose of this is, for us to conceptualize what it should be, to discuss it. But we also understood you couldn't have litigation without a real mass movement to make things happen. The history of this country is that any progressive litigation came as a result of mass movements of people in the streets, not because of some great litigators, that was the end result. So that people have to understand that. And one thing I wanted to add that I think was missing from this discussion, in 2001, the United Nations had a World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. That was the first international body that recognized that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery were crimes against humanity, and that there needed to be reparations. So we have to understand that. It was mentioned in one of the other panels around the importance of the national and international. Tomorrow, Friday, is the anniversary of the commemoration of the assassination of Malcolm X. One of the most important things he did was draw the connections between the struggle of African people here and around the world. So I think in terms of people summing up what this, in terms of following up what this should be, it's got to be people here taking that out, not relying on a few people, but taking this question out, struggling for it, and understanding that if we're going to, that at least from my perspective, from my organization's perspective, reparations is the key issue for African people in the 21st century. And I say African people throughout the diaspora, because it's going to speak to our relationship to whatever structures exist, and the demand and the struggle for it is going to address the question that was just raised around the relationship between capitalism and socialism, because I don't think that capitalism can handle the demand for reparations, particularly as it solidifies. So it's more of a statement than a question. I'm sorry I took advantage of that, but I think it's really important in terms of people going forward to understand what this represents. But it's key to our existence in this century. Black folks are being disappeared, and if we don't understand that, we're gonna be gone. But so I would just take that and for people to raise up that issue. Not just regard this as, oh, this was a nice discussion tonight, but this is really life and death.
Can I just, to build off of that, so yes, we're at a law school, and folks should bring their legal expertise into the movement in all the ways that they can, but you should also bring your full selves into the movement in all the ways you can, right? Like, there are a lot of community organizations, there are a lot of grassroots organizations. They might be looking for somebody that, is going to bring their art skills to something. They might be looking at folks that are going to roll up their sleeves and help people start a cooperative, right? Like an urban farming cooperative. And so yes, like, we need the legal skills that you're building here, but bring your full selves into the movement and connect with organizations. And you'll see that a lot of times our arms are open for folks to bring their full selves into the movement and utilize the multifaceted skills that you may have, and yes, the litigation too, but yeah.
Thank you. A question in the back here?
Yes, hi. I just want to know how can brown folks actually be as, I won't even say allies, but solidarity in the movement of reparations, just because, as it was mentioned, in the Spanish, if anything, with colonialism and the aftermath, and we are descendants of Africans and itself, but because of colorism and all of the goddamn isms, I just want to know how can the movement become more together, because it is a shared struggle.
Well, back, I guess, to understanding our history, right? Because as you said, right, brown people are actually people of African descent. The powers that be have tried to separate that and tried to make us think we weren't all the same and we weren't all together. Also, a lot of brown folks were enslaved, right? So, I mean, there's a direct correlation there, too, and so we have to keep thinking of them as separate. I mean, I know there's some cultural and language differences and whatever, but if we talk about the same history and the same history of exploitation and history of enslavement and continuing history of enslavement, I think that helps. So some of it is just the language and understanding the history better. And then I do think we have to resist the divide and conquer that the colonialists and imperialists keep using and have used, right? I mean, they try to divide us from the continent of Africa, but they also divide us in the Americas, right? And make us think it's different fights and different issues, and that because we speak different languages, that means we don't have the same experiences, and so I think we have to resist all that.
Another question? Where's the, yep, in the green right here.
Hi. I'm an undergraduate student and I study reparations and decoloniality. And my question is, being that Black people were forced to build this settler colonial state that only white people will and only ever benefit from, I think it's important that in this conversation we talk about indigenous people as well, and how the settler colonial state has been built by Black people, but to the violence and erasure of indigenous people. So I'm curious as to how there are efforts being made with Black and indigenous people in the fight for reparations, because I feel like the goal is to not reiterate this system of violence, but to work in solidarity together so that we can get to freedom, because freedom is the goal, not just reiterating the system.
Great question.
I agree. And I don't mean to laugh, I'm just laughing because I can't think of anything better to say than what you already said. I think, yes, I think we need to combine, right, the issues of exploitation and asset stripping. I'm thinking of all the different ways that land was taken away in genocide and bodies taken away and wealth denied, that kind of thing. There have been a few reparations cases that Native Americans have won, but they haven't done enough, right? And it's also another group that African Americans are supposed to see as separate and different from us. And so every time they separate us and disunite us, they win, right? Some of the cases for reparations probably could be even stronger if you add genocide and asset stripping of Native peoples. And then some people have used the examples that they've gotten a little bit as examples that you can do, that reparations are possible, right? But again, usually made to us to think, okay, well then we have to be angry that they got it and we didn't. And I think you're right that doesn't help.
Yeah, I would agree. I think people of African descent and indigenous people in this country have claims on land and labor that were stripped that coexist, but I think in a lot of ways, it's set up as if they clash, right? And so I think we have to be really careful about that, and we have to build the relationships in solidarity so that they do coexist and lift each other up.
I think we have time for one more question here in the front.
Oh, no.
Two more questions. All right, two more. There and there, okay?
So we've spoken a lot about money and reparations coming from federal sources and from state sources. But I was curious about whether there are any instances or any work being done around individual accountability. A friend and I were speaking recently about how, you can always, if there is ever a trail, it's the money trail, right? We know who owned slaves. We know how many slaves they owned. We know what families those are. Is there any work being done towards tracking their descendants and actually trying to approach individual families who have been growing wealth in order to get some of that wealth back? And in addition, are there any movements to try to find out where that wealth went and then to tax people according to wealth, not according to income, in order to stop perpetuating some of the economic genocide that we have had in this country?
I know there is a movement now in terms of around land, right? Like there's a movement now with folks that are doing a lot of organizing around land and reclaiming land, where they are like pushing to get white folks that own land in certain places to give that land over to black farmers and other folks that are trying to build out and reclaim some of that land. I don't know the full kind of accounting of how that's working. I would also say in terms of the individuals, I think yes, but I think there's a way if we put our energy towards individuals that in some ways we have to be really careful that we're not letting the government off. And so I just think that we've got to be careful how much energy we put into trying to find the individuals that profited. The system was put in place for individuals to be able to profit. And so I think the major kind of accounting that has to happen is with the government.
So, I do agree that public money is maybe the most important and maybe the most realistic money to go for, but I actually really believe in taxing wealth. Because really, in the United States, all wealth has been on the backs of exploited people, especially black and brown people. All wealth as it exists now is accumulated from those times when we people of African descent couldn't even own our own bodies, let alone own any other property or anything. And so I do think that if we're talking about reparations, that asking for a wealth tax makes a lot of sense and should be one of the things we asked for, because I actually wrote this somewhere once. I actually think it should be illegal to make more than like 10% of profits. And to have billions of dollars. I think it should be illegal and we should be taxing it. I know that's not going to get me very far, and because I say that, people aren't going to believe in my co-op stuff, but anyway, if we want to be honest about it, right? Everybody who's wealthy in this country right now, it has something to do with cumulative exploitation, be it inheritance or the fact that we have certain jobs that other people couldn't get, or right, and that profits are made because people are exploited, et cetera, et cetera. At some point we have to come to terms with that. And if we really are a moral society that believes in democracy and the well-being of everybody, then that kind of wealth accumulation should be illegal, right? And especially since most of it was because we stripped the assets of other people to get there, or at least somebody in the past did. If we have to recognize that and do something about it.
I think we have time for one last question right here.
Thank you. I'm going to do this in 30 seconds so we can eat. My name is Mirna. I'm a non-black Arab, because there are Arabs who are black. And I just want to address something. Spanish folks are not brown. I'm horrified at that idea. They're not brown. And also, it's what I would want to plug, and it's not a question, I'm sorry, but it's like, this is not just about money, right? It's more than money, but currently we talk a lot about taxes, but we're not looking, for example, that we give $8.4 million per day to Israel to kill children, occupy lands, displace people, and actually hold Black Palestinian, non-Jewish Black Palestinians in open-air camps. And so their money is there. There is $8.4 million that we're giving every damn day to Israeli military forces. And so I just wanted to draw that line that we start thinking, like, for example, when your students are like, no, we can't afford it. And you're like, yeah, actually, we can. And so thank you. And I hope that this panel shouldn't be repeated ever again, that you're busy not surviving, but thriving. And I really thank you for the time that you gave us.
That's it, yep. All right, so I think that's the end of our conversation. I'll welcome Clarence up here to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you. Please join me in giving our panel one more round of applause. So on behalf of the Review of Law and Social Change, as one of the colloquial editors, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight for this conversation. Of course, we would be remiss without acknowledging some of the special folks who made tonight possible. I want to begin by acknowledging all of our speakers for this evening, Nikishi Teafa, Catherine Franke, Robert Wesley, Queen Mother Masharika Jawanza, David Ragland, Joyce Hope Scott, Jennifer Bellamy, Casey Foster, and Jessica Gordon-Namert. Can you please join me in giving them another round of applause? I also want to thank our moderators for this evening, Norinda Hyatt, Deborah Archer, and Vincent Sutherland. And we have a number of partners that we want to acknowledge this evening as well, beginning with the Black Allied Law Students Association here at NYU School of Law, the Office of Student Affairs, the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, and the Center on Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. And then lastly, we wanted to thank a number of our co-sponsors, including Alternative Breaks, American Constitutional Society, APALSA, the Christian Legal Fellowship, DALSA, LALSA, we have a lot of ALSAs here, y'all. MELSA, we want to thank NCOBRA. We want to thank the National Lawyers Guild, both the NYU and New York City chapters. We want to thank PILSA, the Public Interest Law Students Association, PREP, the Prison Reform and Education Project, Rise Indivisible. We also want to thank Law Women, Law Students for Economic Justice, and those are our co-sponsors. And then I want to conclude by saying this. We have held space for a very difficult and heavy conversation. I am so grateful for the people who are in the room today, but I want to hold space for the people who are not. My family is from Alabama. Everyone on my mother's side, for as long as we have been in this country, have been. Alabama has been a part of our story, and I'm thinking about my grandparents tonight, who aren't in this room. My grandparents grew up in the Jim Crow South. They had to attend segregated schools. They had to deal with the economic brutalism that was Jim Crow and the totality that the totally problematic nature that Jim Crow imposes on people. And I want to, for us to hold space for those folks and to have, I think, what many people have recognized tonight is that sense of urgency coming out of this conversation, that a lot of times these conversations can feel very esoteric and academic. After all, we are in a law school. But nonetheless, there is that sense of urgency. We should not allow for another generation of Black people to be subject to the violence of this American state. We should not allow another generation of young Black children to have to grow up wondering if the Constitution speaks to them too. And so I see our mandate as a law journal, as a law community, as a community of folks who are invested in creating a more just and equitable society. I see our mandate is closing the space that exists between where Black people exist and where the Constitution aspires for us as a country to be. So as we leave tonight, the last thing I want to say is not only should we have that mandate for creating change, but we should have that mandate for hope as well. Because having those conversations with my grandparents growing up, if they could maintain a sense of hope despite all of the challenges that they face, none of us are let off the hook for maintaining a sense of hope that change can happen, that this country can change, that every empire, including this American empire, must fall. So I ask that you join. So I ask that each of us carry on that mandate, that you join the work of all our panelists that have spoken tonight in creating that society, to creating that beloved community that Dr. King spoke about. With that being said, please enjoy dinner.